Ah yes, death, the great equalizer. A fate that we all share, but not one we all come to terms with. It's an unusual concept. It's something that everyone's quite aware of, but no one really knows anything about, regardless of what some may claim. Well, this is all very dour and philosophical, Johnny. How about you hurry up and get to that point where you talk about the game? You remember the one? Begins with a Z? And yes, I do. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to today's video, where we'll be taking a look at how the Zelda series handles themes of death. We'll also be taking a look at some real world beliefs and how they may have influenced the games, taking a look at the design and lore behind the games, and also a healthy dose of speculation to keep you all thinking. So please join me, Zelda Daddy, aka ZINK, for the following explosive 10 to 15 minutes you'll definitely want to stick around for. So let's get started. Now, when I mention death, I imagine that a lot of you will be drawn to the idea of a graveyard. I mean, makes sense, it's where a lot of dead people like to hang out, apparently. Don't know what that's about. Graveyards, burial sites or cemeteries could date back as far as 15,000 years ago, but it's actually the Greeks who are credited with creating the term cemetery, which derives from this Greek term, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but it means place of rest or sleeping. Well, this is all very well and good, but what does this have to do with Zelda games? Well, as some of you will know, cemeteries appear in almost every title in the Zelda series. In The Legend of Zelda, the graveyard is located in the westmost section of the map and is haunted by ghosts known as genies or genies, which could derive their name from the Japanese word genie, meaning silver in quality, possibly referring to their otherworldly complexion. This graveyard serves as the pathway to the 6th dungeon and also conceals the magical sword under a grave in the top right corner of the site. In Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, the graveyard can be found towards the centre of the map, southeast from where the game begins, and this is where the King of Hyrule has been laid to rest. And much like the first game, this graveyard too is inhabited by monsters, a theme that we'll see recur quite often throughout the series. In A Link to the Past, the cemetery can be found to the north of Hyrule Castle, and according to the player's guide, buried there were some of the most famous people in Hyrulean history. A nice touch that most players will have probably missed is that in the Dark World, the area where the cemetery stood is known as the Ghostly Garden. A graveyard is a place where life ends and the dead rest, so it makes sense that in the anti-world, the opposite of this would be true, and what was the graveyard is now actually referred to as a garden, a place where life begins and blooms. It's actually very poetic, and if I was in a slightly more appropriate setting, I'd be very hard right now. Ocarina of Time is home to what is probably the most well-known cemetery in the franchise, and this is thanks in part to the unusual and rather slow groundskeeper, Dampé. He'll get a Valentine one day. Oh, well, maybe not. This graveyard is located towards the back of Kakariko Village. Oh, and just so happens to house the entrance to the Shadow Temple, one of the dungeons that is probably the most controversial and darkest, at least thematically, to have appeared in the series. A place that the Hyrulean royal family would rather have you forget, as it was used as a place to interrogate, and some would claim much worse. It's a dark cavern that even the most experienced cave boy would think twice before venturing into, its prevailing theme, of course, being death. Being one of the thematically darkest and moodiest games in the series, it makes sense that Majora's Mask has one of the most interesting burial grounds. Ikana Graveyard can be found in the eastern reaches of Termina and is the final resting place of the royal family who once resided in Ikana Castle. Their graves are patrolled nightly by the undead soldiers of this now desolate society, condemned to an eternity of servitude. And who could forget the giant Captain Kita, leader of the Style Children and former soldier in the Ikanan army, who now lies where an unfavourable battle left him. He can of course be reanimated through the use of the Sonata of Awakening, and should Link rise to his challenge, he will be awarded with the Captain's Hat. Oracle of Seasons Graveyard, found in the southwest corner of Holodrum, very much like Ocarina of Times, also houses the entrance to a dungeon, in this case being the 7th dungeon, the Explorer's Crypt. And Oracle of Ages burial ground, known as Yol Graveyard, is an area that Link will need to access in order to begin this game's trading quest, and then later on revisited in order to retrieve the Zora Flippers and Shovel Rope, items needed to traverse the southern seas of Labruna. Four Swords also features a graveyard, and very much like the very first game in the series, this one too is home to genies, and very much like Ocarina of Times, is also the domicile of the one and only Dampé. Rest in peace, homie. If you travel to the north-northwest of Minish Cap's Hyrule, you'll find yourself wandering a forest maze, very similar in concept to that of the Lost Woods, and should Link navigate his way through, he will find himself in the depths of the Royal Valley, where the cemetery can be found and contains what are possibly the cutest renditions of genies in series, and also the Royal Crypt, a mini dungeon from which Link can retrieve a golden kinstone piece needed to access Vale Falls. In Twilight Princess, the graveyard can once again be found behind Kakariko Village, and like many others before it, is haunted by ghosts, these inarguably being one of the series' scariest iterations of the reoccurring Poe enemy. Link will return here both to meet the Golden Wolf and also to venture into the back wall of the graveyard in order to retrieve the Zora armor. Skyward Sword's graveyard can be found in the southeast edge of Skyloft and acts essentially as a fancy door-locking mechanism. And when the correct grave is struck and then pushed, it will open a door to a shed inside the graveyard that leads to one of Skyward Sword's more interesting characters, Batro, a Corruptorian demon with an unusual liking for children.
I wouldn't dream of terrorizing the people of this town. You see, this adorable little girl is the only one who didn't let loose a blood-curdling scream at the sight of me.
Yeah, that's a nice story you got there, mate. I'm going to call Child Protective Services real quick. In the meantime, you see if you can come up with a slightly better excuse for being a bat nonce. And then finally onto Breath of the Wild, which contains some of the more peculiar burial sites in the games, though there isn't a traditional cemetery to be found in the game. Should you venture to the top of Mount Hylia, situated upon the Great Plateau, you'll find the site where the King of Hyrule himself is buried. Not only that, but should you pursue the Stolen Heirloom Shrine quest, you'll learn that the obelisk protruding from an outcrop to the north of Kakariko Village is actually a grave where Dorian's wife lies. And then onto what is the closest representation to a dedicated burial ground within the game, though I must stress we are treading on slightly more speculative territory with this one. Almost precisely halfway between Kakariko and Hateno Village, shadowed by the cliffs of Quince, there is a cove in which there is a field littered with unusual and somewhat unnerving statues. Though the exact purpose of these statues isn't known, it has been speculated by some to be some form of burial ground, and considering its close proximity to the two villages, there is definitely a compelling case to be made. Some standing taller than Link, the statues themselves appear to represent humanoid figures, and going off their facial expressions, they look to be sleeping peacefully. That is, with the exception of one statue, whose eyes will open at nighttime and begin to glow an unworldly purple. Whether it's some form of malice or another force, whatever it may be, it certainly seems untoward, and this is confirmed as we learn that this statue is called the Cursed Statue. And once shot with an arrow, the statue disintegrates and a shrine towards the back of the cove surfaces, and the grounds return once again to a peaceful slumber. Some might have also noticed ruins of a structure that once stood here, dotted amongst the figures, and upon some of these ruins you will find a crest which appears to depict the Sword of the Six Sages. And though the crest appears to resemble a coffin and the sword somewhat resembling a cross, which may be an indication that this is indeed some form of burial ground, I am actually what we call reaching, my dude. The Sword of the Six Sages is, however, a symbol denoting the denial of darkness, originally formed to banish the Demon King Ganon. Demons, curses, statues, this area in SideQuest could easily, and probably has had, a video dedicated to its meaning, but for the sake of a concise video, we'll leave that one there. Now, I did say that almost all Zelda entries contain some form of graveyard, but this is with the exception of the adult timeline, in which no dedicated cemetery can be found within any of the games. And I don't believe that this is coincidental or down to the fact that a graveyard may be considered too mature of a theme for these cartoony series of games. Hyrule is flooded during the events of Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, and the inhabitants reside on small islands where land is limited. And as a result of this flooding, I would imagine that the tradition to bury their dead was laid to rest, pun intended, so as not to fill up the real estate required by the actual living. And although there is no evidence or reference to support this claim, if you would allow me to postulate, I would say that these communities instead prefer cremations or maybe even sea burials. But what about Spirit Tracks? Well, that's a good point, but if I'm to continue postulating, Spirit Tracks takes place not too long after the events of Phantom Hourglass. A new content is found and a new kingdom is established. And even though the real estate required for a cemetery is now available, I would imagine that New Hyrule's citizens will have inherited the traditions of the inhabitants of Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, that being either cremations or sea burials. And even if that isn't the case, I would say that the kingdom simply hasn't been around long enough to have established a sizable graveyard. For those of you wondering, no, I didn't mention the CDI games, although they do belong buried in a cemetery somewhere, with at least 6 feet of terra firma between them and anyone who runs the risk of playing them. Cemeteries, however, are not the only prominent theme related to death within the Zelda series. There is a term in Japanese folklore known as hitodama, meaning human soul. And this refers to floating balls of blue fire that are believed to be a human soul that has departed its earthly form. This is almost unquestionably the influence behind the reason that the souls of those wandering the twilight appear to match this description. They can also be found surrounding the ghost ship in Wind Waker, as well as King Daphne's in Breath of the Wild, and most recently appearing in what is currently suspected to be the Underground or Dark World in Tears of the Kingdom in one of its recent teasers. And it's not just present in the world of Zelda, other Nintendo titles such as Paper Mario have also entertained this idea. Blue fire also exists within our world. It is a real occurrence. One thing that can cause a flame to burn blue is the presence of carbon and hydrogen, which just so happen to be the second and third most common elements within the human body. Quite fitting considering the idea of Hitodama. Colour of flames isn't just determined by the chemicals present during a reaction though. Fire can appear blue when it burns particularly hot. Take a campfire. When you sit around one, you'll often see yellow, orange, maybe even red hues. And this is down to the oxygen inside the wood and in the atmosphere around it. Not only that, but organic matter like wood burns at a much lower temperature. Your average campfire will burn at about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit or about 800 Celsius. Whereas something like natural gas will burn much hotter, almost twice as hot as wood actually. And this is because there is much more energy in complete combustion, and this energy invigorates and ionizes gas molecules, giving your hob that familiar blue glow. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching, and if you do want to see more content like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll be sure to get working on the next video. But until then, take care of yourselves. I'm actually going to leave now because this place gives me the heebie-jeebies.